Is Putin trapped? The war in Ukraine has now been going on for more than 1,000 days. That's 1,000 days during which Russia and Ukraine have continued to incur losses, both countries trying to use every tool at their disposal to turn the tide of the war. For Ukraine, this has meant receiving more than $230 billion in financial or military aid from NATO and its allies around the world. And the Ukrainian army has put this aid to good use, even managing to counter-invade Russia, the implications of which will be discussed later. For Russia, however, the war has been a disaster from day one. It started with a failed operation aimed at decapitating the Ukrainian government in Kiev. This led to poor mobilization and logistics strategies that ultimately caused the initial invasion of Kiev to be repelled by Ukrainian forces. Then, the Russian Navy was forced to abandon its positions along the Ukrainian coast, a remarkable achievement for Ukraine, considering it has no significant navy to speak of. This brings us to the first half of 2024, which saw negligible gains for the Russian army on the current main front line in the Donbass. But what exactly led to this sudden decline? And is this an indicator that the war could be coming to an end, with Putin finally admitting defeat? The truth about Russia's current situation is nuanced and depends on multiple factors. So let's take a closer look at what exactly caused Russia's military failure in Ukraine and the possible ramifications of the war continuing into 2025. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the first half of 2024 was seen as a phase of preparation for both countries. The Russian army implemented some of its plans in late spring and early summer during the 2024 summer campaign. The campaign involved launching a renewed invasion effort in the Kharkiv region, which had been liberated from Russian occupation in November 2022. By this point, it should be obvious how the summer invasion ended for the Russians. It was a colossal failure. The Russian army used strange tactics in the region, to say the least. Instead of taking advantage of the large number of military vehicles, especially tanks, the Russians mostly relied on infantry-based strategies. Reports from the Kharkiv region at the time suggested that the Russian army used regular soldiers traveling by motorcycle to reach the new front lines as quickly as possible, before abandoning the motorcycles to join their comrades in the trenches. To support this initiative, Russia deployed improvised turtle tanks, T-62, T-72, and T-80 tanks modified with extra metal armor on top. These modifications highlighted Russia's growing desperation on the Kharkiv front, as even its older tanks required makeshift upgrades to remain viable in combat. The turtle tanks had virtually no offensive capability, indicating that Russia was beginning to run out of usable tanks and modern armor on the Kharkiv front. Why is that? Well, the answer may lie in how Russian tanks proved to be far more vulnerable than they should have been. On paper, the T-90 should be a modern tank with combat capabilities comparable to those of the AMX-30, the British Challenger 2, or the German Leopard 2. All these tanks have similar main armaments, electronic warfare, defenses, and optics for nighttime and low-light operations. In fact, the T-90 was touted as having one of the most powerful armors among modern tanks. However, the T-90, like its older cousins, the T-70 and T-80, was equipped with an automatic loader for its main armament, unlike its Western counterparts. This feature allowed the tank to operate with one fewer crew member, but it had a critical design flaw. Spare ammunition was stored both under the main turret in the autoloader and scattered throughout the chassis, a design choice made necessary by the smaller size of Russian tanks. This setup created a devastating vulnerability. If an explosive penetrates the tank and ignites the stored ammunition, whether in the autoloader or elsewhere in the chassis, it can trigger a chain reaction of detonations. This jack-in-the-box effect leads to the catastrophic destruction of the tank, often sending the turret flying. In traditional vehicle-on-vehicle and vehicle-on-infantry combat, this wasn't particularly notable, as the armor was a relatively small target that could only be hit slightly above or below the vehicle, unusual trajectories for ground combat. However, the Ukrainian army used weapons and tactics that exploited this weakness. By using small, commercially available drones and equipping them with grenades or anti-tank mines, Ukrainian drone operators could guide the drone directly above the tank, specifically targeting the hatch or the ammunition storage. The result? The total annihilation of Russian tanks, against which there was virtually no adequate defense from incoming drones. The proliferation of drone-based warfare extended far beyond their use against tanks. Drones were fitted with either surveillance capabilities or explosives, making them vital in practically all scenarios and used by both sides in the conflict. The main advantage of using drones, at least for Ukraine, is that it allows its army to compensate for its two primary weaknesses. The first was a shortage of personnel. Ukraine has about 1/3 of Russia's population, and at the start of the war, its armed forces were outnumbered 5-1. This ratio improved over time as Ukraine stepped up its conscription efforts and volunteers flocked to defend the country. But even today, Ukraine is estimated to have about 70% of Russia's total active manpower and only 60% of its reserve forces. Secondly, drone warfare was a great economic equalizer. The first-person view, FPV drones used by Ukraine for small-scale missions cost as little as $400 to $500, making them highly affordable. Meanwhile, surveillance drones like the DJI Mavic cost between $1,500 and $3,000, according to Reuters. Even more robust models, such as DJI's agricultural drones, cost only a few $1,000s, making drone warfare relatively inexpensive compared to traditional military equipment. More robust drones like DJI's agricultural models come at a higher price. For example, the DJI Agris T10 costs nearly $10,000, while other models in the Agris lineup run into the tens of thousands of dollars. Despite their higher cost, these drones provide significant capabilities, making them valuable assets on the battlefield. Combined with explosives and the modifications needed to make the drone suitable for flight in a more militarized environment, such as extending its total range, Ukraine could deploy a one-time use anti-tank drone for as little as $15,000. Compare that to the average cost of a tank, which ranges from $2 to $4 million, and you'll understand why investing in drones can be cost-effective. Even if only 1 in 10 drones hits a target, which is often the most cited statistic by Ukrainian military squads specializing in drone warfare, it could be worth the investment. Drone warfare also redefined Ukraine's coastal defenses. The first wave of the Russian invasion included the Black Sea Fleet, which blockaded the Ukrainian coast and prevented ships from venturing into deep waters. This led to a rerouting of Ukrainian maritime trade, either by hugging coastal waters through Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria, or by transporting goods over land to Romania and using its port to send ships through the Bosporus. Whichever option was chosen, the increased journey length and logistics drove up global grain prices, as Ukraine is the world's 7th largest wheat exporter. The Ukrainians scored an early victory in April 2022 when they located the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, the Moskva, and attacked it with coastal anti-ship missiles. But the real coup de grace came with drones, this time modified for maritime warfare. Ukraine took drone warfare to a new level by using coastal drones like the Sea Baby and the Magura 5 to target Russian vessels. These surface-based drones carried out nighttime raids that forced the Black Sea Fleet to retreat miles away from the Ukrainian coastline. Most of the fleet has since been relocated to Novorossiysk, leaving Sevastopol largely inoperative due to repeated long-range missile strikes. This has severely limited Russia's naval power in the region. The scale of Ukraine's drone warfare only continued to grow in 2024. Leading to significant losses of Russian equipment that Moscow has struggled to replace. Reports from Russian state agencies like TASS and RIANOVOSTI claimed that Russia deployed its experimental T-14 Armata tanks, a modern upgrade of the T-90, on the battlefield. However, other sources, including the National Interest, dispute these claims, stating that the T-14 was never deployed due to its high cost and ineffectiveness compared to the T-90. Even if they had been deployed, the T-14 would likely have faced the same challenges as other Russian equipment. Ukraine's long-range drone tactics and frequent attacks have made the deployment of costly assets too risky. Ukraine's ability to produce and launch drones on a daily basis has created a constant and cost-effective threat that Russia has struggled to counter. Russia's losses peaked in August 2024 when Ukraine did what was once unthinkable. It occupied Russian territory. The Ukrainian army crossed the border into the Kursk region, taking Russia by surprise. The Kursk invasion began modestly, with reports of 300 to 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers supported by armored vehicles, tanks, and long-range strikes. But the extent of the invasion quickly allowed Ukraine to occupy about 1,300 square kilometers of territory inside Kursk in 3 weeks, more than Russia had gained in the previous 7 months. The Kursk invasion shed light on a few problems Russia seemed to be grappling with, which would only accelerate its eventual downfall. First, the Kremlin's response to the Kursk invasion was counterintuitive, paradoxical, and late. Early reports from Russia suggested that it would launch a counteroffensive within just a few days. And yet the counteroffensive never came. Russian soldiers quickly retreated from the area, with the army building defensive trenches to slow the Ukrainian advance. These same trenches were then used by Ukraine itself once it managed to take control of the territory, as they in turn slowed the Russian counteroffensive. Official Kremlin reports downplayed the real state of the invasion, suggesting that the damage was significantly lower than initially reported. This was, obviously, an attempt to keep the Russian population firmly under the influence of existing propaganda, which perpetuated the idea that Ukrainians were being used by the West to eliminate Russian culture. The propaganda went so far as to label the invaders as terrorists, perhaps a way for Putin to justify more persistent conscription efforts across the country. Second, Ukrainian soldiers encountered relatively little resistance in Kursk. Unlike the contract soldiers fighting on the front, most of the troops stationed in the Russian regions surrounding Ukraine appeared to be conscripts serving mandatory military service. Ukraine managed to capture about 600 men over the 3 weeks of the invasion, and an early report suggested that conscripts accounted for 80% of the prisoners of war processed. Interviews with the prisoners revealed that some conscripts had received only a few weeks of training before being sent to their post. The significant disparity in the use of conscripts versus contract soldiers indicated that Russia was already trying to cut costs as much as possible. Russia's 2024 budget planned to devote up to 40% of government spending to national and military defense. In other words, the country would use about 7% of its GDP for the military, nearly double that of the United States and triple that of most Western countries. Contracts for soldiers had become far more lucrative, with salaries 3 or 4 times the national average, ostensibly to attract as much manpower as possible to the front lines. And yet, while the number of Russian contract soldiers soared in 2023 and 2024, the actual number of troops did not increase. According to Riddle, an independent Russian media outlet that compiled the number of new contracts signed throughout 2023. The figures reported by Russian authorities are significantly inflated compared to what reality suggests. Of the 490,000 contracts in 2023, Riddle estimates that only 150,000 to 200,000 of those represent new troops that Russia could employ. The discrepancy was attributed to much shorter contracts that the army began offering in 2022, usually to prisoners or soldiers leaving mandatory military service. With a contract lasting only 3 to 6 months, a single soldier could renew his contract multiple times, each renewal being counted separately in official statistics. The other, far more significant reason why the Russian army did not grow as much as expected is more concerning. The country is losing troops at an alarming rate. British military intelligence suggested that Russia had suffered up to 700,000 military casualties by the end of October 2024. This figure includes both deaths and injuries preventing future military service. Out of this total, about 70,000 deaths had been confirmed by the end of September 2024, according to independent Russian media outlets like Mediazona and Meduza, as well as BBC Russia. However, a BBC report suggests that the actual number of deaths is likely much higher due to the lack of transparency in reporting military losses. Worse still for Putin, Russian losses continue to climb. September 2024 was deemed the deadliest month of the war so far, marking the 5th consecutive month in which the daily casualty rate never dropped below 1,000 soldiers. But October broke that record, with losses nearing 1,400 soldiers per day throughout the month. Ukrainian intelligence suggested that in total, Russia lost more than 40,000 soldiers in October alone. And November 2024 appears to be following the same trend, with daily casualty rates ranging between 1,500 and 1,700 soldiers. In September 2024, total losses were estimated at around 640,000. But if the monthly trend continues, Russia could well reach 800,000 soldiers lost by the end of 2024 and surpass the 1 million mark fairly early in 2025. In simple terms, Russia cannot recruit enough soldiers in time to replenish its ranks. Contract soldiers have less and less time to train before being deployed to the front. This, coupled with the fact that Russia has fewer and fewer modern armored vehicles to protect them, is likely the main reason behind the rising casualty rate. The more soldiers die, the more replacements are needed. The Donbas meat grinder continues to relentlessly consume Russian lives. The Kursk invasion led Putin to adopt harsh and quite desperate measures to maintain the image of a Russian army capable of outperforming Ukraine. The first of these measures was the frequent nuclear red lines that Russia drew around the war. The country's nuclear defense policy continued to evolve in terms of what Russia considers grounds for using its nuclear weapons to defend its territory. Before the war, the policy was generally aimed at other nuclear powers, such as the United States or China, warning them against a direct conflict with Russia. After the war began, Putin started invoking the country's nuclear reserves whenever NATO suggested sending more advanced weapons to Ukraine. Similar threats delayed deliveries of long-range weapons, particularly missiles capable of targeting critical Russian infrastructure near Moscow. When the Kursk invasion took place, one of these red lines was crossed, namely Ukraine's ability to penetrate Russian territory and attempt an occupation. And yet there was no nuclear response from Putin at that time. The Kursk disaster led NATO to adopt a more aggressive stance toward Russia, with NATO military leaders advocating for Ukraine to be allowed to use long-range missiles to target Russian military facilities and infrastructure. This was one of the few restrictions the United States had placed on weapons delivered to Ukraine, and it remained in effect until now. In late November, the outgoing administration of President Joe Biden approved the use of long-range ATACMS missiles transferred to Ukraine in April 2024 on Russian territory. The exact wording of the authorization seems to imply that the weapons will be used in Kursk, at least for now, with Ukraine using the missiles to cut off the supply lines of Russian forces in the ongoing counteroffensive, which we'll talk about later. This directly contradicts Putin's warnings that Russia would use nuclear missiles if Ukraine began using conventional weapons in Russia. But with the many nuclear-related warnings Putin has issued over the last 1,000 days, and with no actual response, NATO might be willing to take that risk. The decision to authorize ATACMS came about because Ukraine already has significant long-range options in its kamikaze drone industry. Ukraine has launched devastating drone attacks deep inside Russian territory since September, one of the largest having taken place on September 10th, using more than 140 drones that managed to strike the Russian capital, Moscow. The other way Russia has tried to regain some prestige is by attempting to retake Kursk. This time, conscripts wouldn't be enough, so Putin turned to one of his few allies, North Korea. In mid-October, reports from South Korean intelligence began to circulate, indicating that thousands of North Korean soldiers were being transferred to Russia. Early reports suggested that about 3,000 people were moving to the Russian Far East region. These reports were corroborated a few days later by Ukrainian intelligence, which suggested that up to 10,000 soldiers were being transferred directly into the Kursk and Belgorod regions. two areas where Ukraine has launched ground offensives. The presence of North Koreans in Russia constituted one of the war's main escalations, as it implied direct intervention by a third-party army, beyond mere aid or volunteer service. Ukrainian media outlets suggested that North Korea could send up to 12,000 soldiers in the first wave to Russia. Russia used the Kursk invasion as proof that its territory was under threat, and invoked a defense pact signed with North Korea in June of this year to justify the presence of North Korean troops on its soil. The involvement of these North Korean troops in Kursk is fairly obvious. Putin will use them to bolster troop numbers. The wording of the defense pact, as ambiguous as Russia's nuclear deterrence policy, implies that North Korean troops could probably only be deployed on Russian territory. However, there's no guarantee that Putin plans to honor this restriction for long. North Korean troops have already begun clashing with Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk as part of the Russian counteroffensive, which began in September. Reports from a Russian major general suggested that by mid-October, Russia had retaken about 50% of the territory. However, more recent reports from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense indicate that Russia has actually recaptured only 40% of the occupied territory. Most of the North Korean forces, however, are still in training, and Ukrainian intelligence suggests they may not be of much use to Russia. This is because these troops have far less experience in the types of warfare prevalent on the Ukrainian-Russian front, as well as facing a language barrier. The last time North Korea was involved in active conflict was in 1953, when the Korean War ground to a halt and the Korean Demilitarized Zone was established. Moreover, North Korea acquired much of its military equipment from the former Soviet Union, which likely makes its military industry obsolete in many ways. Additionally, reports from North Korean defectors who served in the army suggest that soldiers often lack proper training and nutrition, making them ineffective in actual combat. Russia's counteroffensive in Kursk has two objectives. First, by retaking Kursk, Putin hopes to restore the image that Russia is winning the war, since Ukraine's occupation of part of Russian territory would give the latter an advantage in any potential peace negotiations. Second, by using North Korean soldiers rather than local forces, the Russian army can focus its efforts on the main front in the Donbass, where the fighting is intensifying by the day. The significant losses Russia is suffering will prevent it from maintaining the upper hand in the conflict, at least for now. This is reflected in Russia's reliance on long-range missiles and drone attacks, including the use of an intermediate-range ballistic missile with a range of about 5,500 kilometers to strike deeper into Ukrainian military and even civilian facilities. Added to this is the fact that Russia possesses far more artillery, partly thanks to North Korea, which will have sent more than 8 million artillery shells by the end of 2024, allowing it to compensate for its manpower losses. However, the continued presence of North Koreans on the front could alienate one of Russia's biggest allies, China. China's support for Russia in this conflict has been limited to covert tactics such as allowing Russia to circumvent economic sanctions and deepening Russia's dependence on China for money. But even this has been enough to place China under the spotlight as a steadfast ally of Russia. If the presence of North Korean troops in Russia persists, or worse, if it leads to the arrival of more troops, NATO might be prompted to increase its support for Ukraine in return. The escalation of the war could also push China to take an official position on the conflict, which could cause it to lose significant influence in the Indo-Pacific and in Africa. These are regions with which China hopes to establish favorable trade relations, so losing them could represent a major loss of potential for China's resource-hungry industry. And with the inauguration of former President Donald Trump as the 47th President of the United States, attention has turned to how his administration will approach the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The Biden administration, in its final days, pushed to approve as much aid as possible for Ukraine, anticipating uncertainty regarding Trump's policy toward Russia and Ukraine. This puts Putin under pressure. His counteroffensive in Kursk has yet to yield a decisive victory, and with parts of Russian territory still under Ukrainian control, it remains difficult for him to convincingly claim dominance in the war. Given these dynamics, Putin might view Trump's presidency as a potential opportunity to end the war on terms favorable to Russia. However, Trump's true stance on the conflict remains uncertain. But what do you think? How will Trump's return to the White House affect Ukraine's plans?